Evelyn Carter drove the hammer down so hard, the anvil rang like a church bell on Judgment Morning. Sparks flew across the dirt floor of the old shed, and her jaw was set like iron, and her eyes didn't blink once. Behind her, the entire town of Willow Creek, Montana had gathered at the fence, watching, whispering, shaking their heads at the mail-order bride who had walked away from the finest bedroom in the territory, to stand inside a broken, half-rotted shed with fire in her hands, and something fiercer than fire in her chest. If this story already has you leaning in, please subscribe to our channel and hit that bell so you never miss a single chapter. Drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay with me all the way to the end, because I promise you this woman's journey is one you will not forget. The stagecoach pulled into Willow Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in July of 1884. And before the door even swung open, the women gathered on the boardwalk had already decided what kind of woman was going to step out of it. Desperate. That was the word they passed between themselves like a secret. Desperate or ruined or both. Because only a woman with no other options would answer a stranger's advertisement in an Eastern newspaper and agree to travel 2,000 miles across unfamiliar country to marry a man she had never once laid eyes on. Martha Greaves, who ran the dry goods store and considered herself the moral compass of the entire territory, folded her arms and pressed her lips together. "Poor creature," she said, and she didn't say it quietly. She said it the way women like her always said things loudly enough to be heard softly enough to pretend she hadn't meant it that way. Beside her, Dorothy Hale, the banker's wife, clicked her tongue. "I heard she's from Philadelphia. A city woman. She won't last a season. She married Thomas Walker through a letter," said the third woman, Agnes Cole, whose husband ran the feed store. "A letter. Didn't even ask for a photograph first. What does that tell you?" It told them everything they thought they needed to know. The stagecoach door opened, and Evelyn Carter stepped down into the dust of Willow Creek, Montana, carrying one wooden trunk, wearing a dress that had been washed so many times the blue had faded to the color of a winter sky, and holding her chin at an angle that didn't match a single thing those women had prepared themselves to see. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't clutching a handkerchief. She wasn't blinking back tears or scanning the crowd with the wide, frightened eyes of a woman who had run out of options. She was looking at the town the way a surveyor looks at land she is already calculating. Thomas Walker was waiting near the post office, hat in hand, and he was a tall man with a weathered face and broad shoulders, and the particular kind of stillness that comes from spending too many years alone. He was 40 years old and had been a widower for 6 of them, and the nervousness he felt standing there was something he hadn't felt since he was a young man, and he didn't know what to do with it, so he just stood there and turned the brim of his hat in his hands and waited. When Evelyn walked toward him, the crowd went quieter than a church. "Mr. Walker," she said, and her voice was steady and clear. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mrs. Walker, I mean. That is—" He stopped. Color climbed up the back of his neck. "I'm not much good at this kind of thing." "Neither am I," she said. "So we're well matched already." He didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure if it was a comfort or a warning. He settled on offering her his arm, and she took it, and the two of them walked toward the wagon he'd parked at the end of the street, and the women on the boardwalk watched every step and said nothing, and then said everything the moment the wagon rolled out of sight. The ride out to the Walker Ranch took 40 minutes on a road that had been cut through the grassland by years of wagon wheels and boot heels, and Thomas spent most of it telling her about the property in the careful, thorough way a man describes something he is proud of and slightly ashamed of at the same time. "It's a working cattle ranch," he said. "About 2,000 acres. We run about 400 head most seasons, though the numbers have been down." He paused. "The house is big. Bigger than most out here. Built it myself mostly after my wife passed. Gave me something to do." Evelyn was watching the landscape move past. "What was her name?" He looked at her sideways. Most people didn't ask that. "Clara," he said. "Was she from here?" "Born here. Grew up 2 farms over." He was quiet for a moment. "She knew this land the way you know your own hand. I never did figure out how to run it without her." Evelyn didn't offer sympathy, and he was grateful for that. She just nodded once the way a person does when they are filing information away, and then she went back to watching the road. When the wagon came over the last low hill and the ranch spread out below them, Thomas pulled back on the reins and let the horses slow, because he always stopped here. It was habit. Clara had loved this view. Evelyn looked at it all: the main house with its wide porch and freshly painted shutters, the bunkhouse to the east, the cattle pens beyond that, the garden that had gone mostly to weeds along the south fence, and then past the garden half hidden behind an overgrown stand of cottonwood trees, she saw something that made her go very still. A shed. Old. Weathered to gray. Part of the roof had collapsed inward, and the walls leaned toward each other like two old men tired of standing up straight. A rusted chimney pipe came up through the broken roof at a wrong angle, and the door hung on one hinge, and had been swinging in the summer wind long enough that the bottom edge had worn a pale arc into the dirt. "What's that?" Evelyn asked. "Old blacksmith shed," Thomas said, and his voice dropped a register the way it does when a man mentions something he'd rather not think about. "Belonged to the original homesteader. Hasn't been used in 15, maybe 20 years. I keep meaning to tear it down." "Don't," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "Don't what?" "Don't tear it down." There was something in her voice that made him not ask why. He clicked to the horses and the wagon rolled on down toward the house. Thomas had prepared for her arrival with more care than he would ever admit out loud. The main bedroom had fresh curtains, yellow ones, because he hadn't known her favorite color, and yellow had seemed safe. The sitting room had flowers in a jar on the side table, dried ones from last autumn, because nothing was blooming yet in the garden, and he'd positioned the armchair near the window so she could look out at the valley in the evenings. He'd told his ranch hand, Billy, to make sure the kitchen was clean, and Billy had tried, and it was clean in the way things are clean when a man has done it. He showed her through every room with the stiff formality of a man who doesn't quite know how to be proud of something without also being embarrassed by the pride. "The bedroom is yours," he said. "I'll be in the room at the end of the hall. There's no need for you to, I don't expect—" "Mr. Walker," she said. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas." She said his name like she was trying it on, deciding whether it fit. "I appreciate everything you've prepared. I can see the work you've put into this." She paused. "But I need to be honest with you about something." He braced himself. He didn't know what for exactly, but something in her tone made a man brace himself. "I don't want the bedroom," she said. He stared at her. "Beg pardon? Not permanently. I'll sleep here until I get the shed sorted. But that's where I want to work. That's where I want my things." She met his eyes. "I know that's not what you expected. I know it sounds strange. But I need you to understand that it's not that I'm ungrateful. It's that I cannot be useful to you, or to anyone, if I'm sitting in a parlor staring at dried flowers." Thomas Walker stood in the middle of his carefully prepared sitting room and looked at his new wife for a long moment. Then he said, "You want to work in a 20-year-old collapsed blacksmith shed?" "Yes. That doesn't even have a full roof." "I'll fix the roof." He opened his mouth, closed it again, looked out the window toward the cottonwoods, looked back at her. "All right," he said finally, and he said it the way a man says something when he doesn't understand it, but doesn't have a good reason to refuse it, and that was the first honest conversation they ever had. Word got to town before breakfast the next morning, because Billy the ranch hand had a girl whose mother was friends with Agnes Cole. And by the time Evelyn was pulling the first boards off the shed wall to assess what she was working with, the women of Willow Creek had already decided she had lost her mind. "Rejected a mansion," Dorothy Hale announced at the dry goods store, and she said it with the satisfied weight of a woman confirming what she had always suspected. "A beautiful house with yellow curtains, and she's sleeping in a shed." "Thomas must be mortified," said Martha Greaves. "Thomas must be wondering what he's gotten himself into," said a third voice. "We all know what he's gotten himself into," said Martha, and they all nodded with the private pleasure of women who have already made up their minds. What none of them knew, what no one in Willow Creek knew, was what Evelyn was unpacking from the bottom of that wooden trunk. She had waited until the house was quiet and Thomas's boots had stopped moving down the hall. Then she had carried the trunk out to the shed herself by moonlight, and she had opened the bottom panel. The false one. The one her father had built. And she had lifted out the tools wrapped in oilcloth that she had carried across 2,000 miles and 3 state lines without telling a single living soul they were there. Her father's tools. Henry Carter had been the best blacksmith in Delaware County, Pennsylvania for 30 years, and when he died, his shop had gone to debt, and his tools should have gone to auction. But Evelyn had gotten there first. She had taken what mattered and left everything else behind, and she had not looked back once. She unwrapped each tool the way you'd unwrap something sacred. The hammer with the cracked hickory handle she'd repaired herself at 16. The set of tongs her father had made her as a birthday gift the year she turned 14, because she had already been his best student for 3 years by then, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The files and chisels and punches and drifts, each one worn to the exact shape of hands that had passed them down. She laid them out in the shed in the moonlight and looked at them for a long time. Then she picked up the hammer and felt the familiar weight of it settle into her palm, and something in her chest that had been clenched for 2 years finally slowly let go. She had not been able to work since her father died. The shop was gone. The community she'd grown up in hadn't known what to do with a woman who knew more about iron and fire than most of the men they'd hired, and they'd made that clear in the ways communities make things clear, not with words exactly, but with a steady accumulating pressure that closed off one door after another until she was standing in her landlady's parlor in Philadelphia, with a newspaper in her hands and an advertisement circled in ink, and she had thought, well, the West then. She hadn't come to Montana to be rescued. She had come to find space enough to breathe. By the end of the first week, the shed had a repaired roof. Thomas found the materials one morning with a note in Evelyn's handwriting that said simply, "I need these." He bought them without asking why. By the end of the second week, the collapsed wall had been shored up with new timber. She had done the work herself, rising before dawn, and when Billy wandered over to offer help, she said, "I appreciate it. Hand me that crossbeam." And he did, and he didn't say a word about it to anyone, except that she was stronger than she looked, and faster with a nail than most men he knew. The furnace was the hard part. The old one was cracked beyond repair, and she needed a working forge if she was going to do anything worth doing. She thought about it for 4 days. She thought about it while she was eating breakfast, and while she was helping Thomas look over the ranch accounts, which he'd shown her sheepishly, and which she'd immediately identified 3 errors in, and on the 5th day, she went to Thomas and said, "I need to buy parts for a forge." He looked at her over his coffee. "How much?" she told him. He didn't flinch. He pulled out his wallet. "Thomas," she said. "It's your money too," he said, and went back to his coffee. And that was the second honest conversation they had. The forge was operational on a Saturday morning in late August, and the first thing Evelyn did when the fire caught and the coals began to glow was stand in front of it with her eyes closed for just a moment, feeling the heat press against her face, and let herself feel it. The grief and the relief and the something else that didn't have a name yet, all of it moving through her like weather. Then she put on her apron and picked up her hammer and went to work. She was 3 hours in when she heard the knock at the shed door, which she'd propped open to let the heat out. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am." It was a farmer she didn't recognize, middle-aged, sunburned hat in both hands, with the specific posture of a man who is embarrassed to be asking for help. I heard you might. I got a wagon wheel that's cracked through, and the blacksmith in town. Coleman, he's backed up 2 weeks, and I can't wait 2 weeks. Harvest won't wait 2 weeks." He stopped. "I heard you fix things." Evelyn looked at him over the lip of the forge. "Bring it in," she said. His name was James Miller. He had a wife and 3 children and 160 acres of wheat that needed to come in before the first frost, and the cracked wheel had been keeping him awake for 4 nights. He stood in the doorway of the shed and watched Evelyn examine the wheel with her hands, and her eyes running her fingers along the crack testing the metal, turning it, and he couldn't figure out what to make of her. This quiet woman with the calloused hands, and the steady eyes who moved around a forge like she'd been born next to one. "It's a clean break," she said. "Good metal. I can fix this." "How long?" 2 hours, maybe less. He looked at the forge, looked at her. Ma'am, I don't have much money to—" "James Miller," she said, because he'd told her his name at the door. "Yes, ma'am." "Did I mention money?" He blinked. "No, ma'am." "Then go sit down and let me work." He sat on the stool she pointed to, and for 2 hours he watched her work, and he didn't say a word because there was something in the way she moved that made a person go quiet. The efficiency of it, the certainty, the absence of hesitation. She moved around that forge the way a musician moves around an instrument they have been playing their whole life, which was because that was exactly what it was. When she handed him back the wheel, the crack was gone. The metal was clean and strong, the repair so well done that he couldn't find the seam even running his thumbnail along it. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had gone rough around the edges. "I thank you. I don't know how to—" "Thank me by getting your harvest in," she said. "Go on now." He went. She turned back to her forge and didn't see the way he stopped outside the shed door and stood there for a moment with the repaired wheel in his hands, looking at it before he walked back to his wagon. She didn't see it, but she would hear about it later because James Miller went back to his farm and told his wife, and his wife told her sister told the woman at the post office, and the woman at the post office told everyone. By the time September arrived, they were coming from 3 farms over. Not openly, not yet. Men didn't come openly to a woman's workshop in 1884 in Willow Creek, Montana. They came at dawn, or at dusk, or on their way back from somewhere else with a broken plow blade tucked under the seat of the wagon, or a set of horseshoes gone thin from wear, or a harness buckle cracked clear through. They came the way people come to anything they haven't been told they're allowed to want sideways and quietly, and with the specific gratitude of people who haven't been helped in a long time. Evelyn fixed everything they brought her. She didn't talk much while she worked. She asked questions when she needed to. What load does this carry? How long has this been cracking? Does the horse favor one side, and the rest of the time she let the hammer speak? Thomas watched all of this from a careful distance, and what he saw in those weeks was something he didn't know how to name yet. He had expected many things from this arrangement. He had expected a competent household manager, maybe. A woman who could handle the domestic half of a ranch operation. Someone to talk to in the evenings. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to come into the kitchen at 6 in the morning and find her already gone, and to walk out to the shed and see the forge already lit, and a man he didn't recognize standing in the doorway, turning his hat in his hands with the look of a man being given something he'd almost given up on. One evening he brought her coffee. He almost didn't. It felt like an intrusion, and he was a man who respected people's space partly out of courtesy, and partly because Clara had taught him that the way you love someone is to understand what they need to be left alone to do. But the September air had gone cold, and the light in the shed had been burning for 11 hours, and he found himself walking across the yard with 2 cups before he'd made a decision about it. She was at the workbench when he came in cleaning her tools with a rag, and she looked up when she heard his boots. "Brought coffee," he said, and held out the cup because he couldn't think of anything else to say. She took it, wrapped both hands around it. "Thank you." He stood there a moment too long, looking at the tools laid out on the bench, the organized beauty of them, each one placed just so. "Your father's?" he asked. She looked at him. She hadn't told him about her father, but she had left the trunk open one morning and he had seen, and he hadn't said anything, and now he was asking in the careful, low-voiced way of a man who knows he is stepping into something that matters. "Yes," she said. "What was he like?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The kind of man who taught his daughter everything he knew and never once told her she shouldn't know it." Thomas nodded slowly. He understood the particular worth of that kind of man. "What happened to him?" he asked. "He died," she said. 3 years ago. And the shop went to debt and the tools would have gone to auction and She stopped. Set down her coffee. Picked up the hammer with the cracked hickory handle. "I got there first. You carried them all the way here." "All the way here." He looked at the hammer in her hand. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. "I'm glad you did," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she said quietly, "So am I." and meant more by it than just the tools, and he understood that, and neither of them said anything else about it that night. But something had shifted. Something had cracked open just slightly, the way ice cracks in early spring, not breaking all at once, but giving just enough. He was halfway to the door when she said, "Thomas?" He stopped. "Coleman has started telling people I'm undercutting his prices." She said it matter-of-factly without alarm. "And Victor Harrington was in town today, asking questions about who's been using the shed." Thomas turned around. "What kind of questions?" "The kind a man asks," she said, "when he's trying to figure out how much of a problem something is." He stood there with his coffee cup and looked at his wife in the firelight of the forge she had built with her own hands, and he said, "Do I need to be worried?" And Evelyn Carter, who had traveled 2,000 miles with her dead father's tools hidden in a false-bottom trunk, who had repaired a collapsed shed with her own 2 hands, who had fed fire into a dead forge and brought it back to life, who had fixed more broken things in 6 weeks than the town blacksmith had managed. In a season looked at him steadily and said, "Not yet." But they both heard the word under that one. Yet. The word yet hung in the air of that shed long after Thomas walked back to the house. Evelyn stood at her workbench and listened to his boots cross the yard, and then she listened to the silence that came after, and she thought about Victor Harrington, the way you think about weather, you can smell before it arrives. Not with panic, but with the particular alertness of someone who has learned the hard way that ignoring warning signs costs more than acting on them. She had seen men like Victor Harrington before. Not here, not in Montana, but back in Philadelphia, back in the world she'd come from. Men who built their power not on what they created, but on what they controlled. Men who didn't hate you personally, that would require caring about you as a person, but who recognized you as a variable in an equation they had already solved, and who moved to eliminate variables with the calm efficiency of bookkeeping. She knew what she was to him. She was a variable. She just hadn't decided yet what she was going to do about it. The next morning, James Miller came back, not with a broken wheel this time. He came with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that told her this was a different kind of visit, and he stood in the doorway of the shed and said, "Mrs. Walker, I need to tell you something." "Then tell me," she said without looking up from the file she was running along a blade edge. "Victor Harrington came to my farm yesterday evening." He said it quickly, like he'd been rehearsing it. "He sat in my kitchen and drank my wife's coffee and told me that he was thinking about calling in my loan, the one I took from him 3 years ago when the drought came." He stopped. "It's not due for another 8 months. He's not supposed to be able to call it early, but he said he'd been looking at the terms again, and he thought there might be language in there that gave him that right, and he was going to have his lawyer look it over." Now Evelyn looked up. "Did he say why he was bringing this up now?" she asked. James Miller's jaw tightened. "He didn't say it outright. He's not that kind of man. He said it while he was looking out my kitchen window at the wheel on my wagon." A pause. "The wheel you fixed." The file went still in her hand. "He wanted you to know," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "He wanted you to stop coming here." "Yes, ma'am." She set the file down on the bench. She looked at him steadily. "And what are you going to do, James?" He looked at the floor. Then he looked at her. "I came here this morning, didn't I?" She picked the file back up. "Yes, you did." He nodded once, the sharp nod of a man who has made a decision and intends to live with it, and then he said, "I also came because there are 2 other farmers I know who've been wanting to bring things to you. Good men. They're scared of Harrington, and I don't blame them for it. But I told them what you did with that wheel." He paused. "I told them the seam was gone, like it never cracked at all." "Send them," Evelyn said. "Harrington won't like it." "No," she agreed. "He won't." James Miller left. Evelyn stood at her forge and let the weight of what he'd told her settle through her bones, and then she picked up her hammer and went back to work, because the way she had learned to think through problems was with her hands moving. They came, the 2 farmers James had mentioned, and then a third who had heard from the second, and by the second week of October there was a quiet, unofficial pattern establishing itself. 6 in the morning, before the town was fully awake. last light of the evening when the roads were empty. Men with broken things arriving at a shed on the Walker Ranch, leaving with those broken things made whole, and not one of them talking about it in the open. Richard Coleman noticed. Coleman had been the blacksmith in Willow Creek for 11 years, and he was not a bad craftsman, but he was a slow one, and he had the particular arrogance of a man who has been the only option in a place long enough to forget that being the only option is not the same as being the best one. He ran a clean shop on the main street, and he charged what he liked, and he made people wait as long as he felt like making them wait. And until September of 1884, no one had said a word about it, because there was no one else. He came to the Walker Ranch on a Wednesday morning and knocked on the door of the main house, and when Thomas answered, Coleman didn't take his hat off. "I need to talk to your wife," he said. Thomas looked at him for a moment. "About what?" "About the fact that she's running a competing business out of your property without a license and stealing my customers." "Is she stealing them?" Thomas said. "Or are they choosing to go somewhere else?" Coleman's face went red. "Walker, she's in the shed," Thomas said, and closed the door. Coleman crossed the yard with the particular stride of a man working himself into a confrontation, and Evelyn heard him coming. She always heard things coming. It was a habit born of years of paying attention, and she had set down her hammer and turned to face the door before he reached it. He stepped into the shed and stopped. She could see him taking in the space, the clean workbench, the organized tools, the forge burning steady and hot, and she could see him recalibrating because whatever he'd expected, it wasn't this. "Coleman," she said. "Mrs. Walker." He said it with a particular emphasis that was meant to remind her of her place. "I think we need to have a conversation about what you're doing out here." "What am I doing out here?" she asked. "You're running a blacksmith operation, without a license, undercutting my prices, taking my customers." "I'm fixing things for my neighbors," she said. "Most of them weren't your customers. They were people who couldn't afford to wait 2 weeks." "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "A woman has no business running a forge." Evelyn picked up her hammer. Not aggressively, she just picked it up the way you pick up the thing you're supposed to be holding. "And yet here I am," she said, running one. His mouth opened, closed. "Mr. Coleman," she said, and her voice was quiet, but there was an edge in it that she usually kept put away. "I have no interest in putting you out of business. I am not competing with you. I am doing what my neighbors need done when they need it done. If you were doing that, they wouldn't be coming to me." She paused. "That's not my problem. That's yours." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Harrington's going to hear about this." "He already has," she said. He left without another word. She listened to his boots stomp back across the yard, and she let out a slow breath, and she thought, there it is. There is the shape of it. Coleman running to Harrington. Harrington with his loans and his contracts and his lawyer. And somewhere in the middle of that, a question about how far they were willing to go and how much she was willing to risk. She thought about her father, about the way he used to say that iron doesn't tell you what it is until you put heat to it. People she had learned were the same. Thomas came to the shed that evening. He didn't knock. He'd stopped knocking after the second week, and she had noticed and said nothing because she found she didn't mind. He came in and stood near the forge and said, "Coleman paid me a visit." "I know," she said. "I talked to him." "He mentioned Harrington." "He did." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man turning something over, examining it from different sides. "What do you know about Victor Harrington?" he asked. "What do you know?" she returned. He pulled a stool over and sat down. Another thing that had happened gradually, the sitting, the staying, and he said, "I know he owns the bank's largest accounts. I know he's got loans out on at least a third of the farms in this county. I know he came here from somewhere back east about 12 years ago with money no one could quite account for, and he's been building ever since." He looked at her. "I know he doesn't like things he can't control." "And can he control you?" Evelyn asked. "He's tried." Thomas's voice was dry. "I've got no loans with him. My ranch is free and clear. That's probably the only reason he hasn't moved on me before now." He paused. But he can make it hard to do business. He can talk to the buyers I sell cattle to. There are ways. Evelyn nodded. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead the way her father had taught her to think not just about the problem in front of you, but about the problem behind the problem. Have you ever looked at those loan contracts? She asked. The ones he holds on the farmers? Thomas frowned. Not closely. Why? Because James Miller told me Harrington claimed there was language giving him the right to call the loan early. But I know something about contracts, Thomas. My father dealt with suppliers and creditors his whole career, and I read every piece of paper that came through that shop by the time I was 20. Language that allows early calling of a loan that's not standard. That's something you'd have to put in deliberately. She looked at him. I want to see those contracts. Harrington holds them. Miller has a copy, she said. He brought it to me this morning, after he brought me a broken draw knife he claimed he was fixing. She allowed herself a small private smile. He's not as subtle as he thinks he is. Thomas looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize. It was the look of a man being consistently surprised by the same person, and starting to find that the surprise was not unpleasant. You've been thinking about this since he came to see Miller, Thomas said. I've been thinking about it since the night you told me Harrington was asking questions, she said. Before that even. The moment Coleman came in here talking about customers, I was supposedly stealing men who had nothing to begin with. I knew this wasn't about me. Not really. It was about them, the farmers. He's been using those loans like a leash, and what I've been doing. She gestured at the forge at the tools at the space she had built from nothing. What I've been doing is cutting the leash, one repair at a time. Thomas sat with that for a moment. Then he said, show me the contract. They sat at the kitchen table that night. The two of them with James Miller's loan document spread out between them, and 2 cups of coffee going cold at their elbows, and Evelyn read it the way her father had taught her to read contracts, not for what the words said, but for what the spaces between them were hiding. It took her 40 minutes to find it. There, she said, and put her finger on a clause in the 3rd page. A subordinate clause buried inside a paragraph about payment schedules, written in the kind of dense, impenetrable language that was meant to be skipped over. He's not wrong that the language is there, but he's wrong about what it means. Thomas leaned over her shoulder to look. What does it mean? It means he can accelerate the loan if the borrower is in material default. Which sounds broad, but look at the definition of material default. It's 5 lines up in the 2nd paragraph. It specifically defines it as a missed payment or a demonstrated decline in the collateral value of the property. She looked up. James Miller has never missed a payment, and his land isn't declining in value. If anything after this harvest, it's worth more. She tapped the page. Harrington can't touch him. He's counting on James not knowing that. Thomas stared at the document. Then he stared at her. How, he said. Do you know how to read a contract like that? She sat back. Because my father signed one he didn't read carefully enough, she said, and it cost him his shop. The silence in the kitchen was the particular silence of a statement that doesn't need anything added to it. Thomas straightened up. He picked up his coffee cup, found it cold, set it down again. He said, We need to look at the other contracts. Yes, she said, we do. That was how it started. Not with a confrontation, not with a declaration, not with anything that would have made a dramatic story if you'd been watching from outside. It started with a kitchen table and a lamp burning low and 2 people sitting with their heads bent over a document and a woman saying, there, and a man saying, how do you know? And the answer being the kind of answer that comes from grief and loss and the particular education that life administers when it takes things from you. The farmers came quietly in 1s and 2s over the next 2 weeks. Not to the shed this time, to the kitchen. Evelyn sat at the table and read their contracts and told them what Harrington could and could not do, and she did it plainly, without softening it and without dramatizing it. And the men sat across from her with their hands around coffee cups and their faces doing the complicated thing that faces do when they're learning that the fear they've been carrying was built on something less solid than they thought. Not all the news was good. 2 of the contracts did have language that gave Harrington genuine leverage, not the right to call the loans early, but provisions about property use that were broad enough to be weaponized. Those men, Evelyn told them straight, needed to be careful. She wrote out exactly what the provisions said and exactly what Harrington would have to prove to invoke them, and she told them where the lines were. "You're not a lawyer," one of the men said, Frank Dawes, older, skeptical, the kind of man who defaults to distrust. "How do I know what you're telling me is right?" "You don't," Evelyn said. "Get a lawyer if you can afford one. If you can't, look at what I've written, and look at your contract, and see if you can find anything that contradicts it. I'll be here." He looked at her. "You're not charging us anything." "No." "Why not?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about her father, and the shop, and the contract he'd signed, and the man who'd written it, who had known exactly what the language meant, and had counted on Henry Carter not knowing. "Because someone should have done this for my father," she said. Dawes looked at the papers in front of him for a long moment. Then he said, "All right," and he didn't say anything else. But when he stood up to leave, he picked up his hat and held it at his side instead of jamming it back on his head the way he'd come in. And that small thing meant something, and they both knew it. By November, Evelyn had reviewed 11 contracts. By mid-November, she had identified a pattern. It wasn't random the way Harrington had written those provisions. The same clauses appeared with minor variations in 7 of the 11 contracts. The same language about property use. The same definition of material default that sounded broad but was actually narrow. And in 3 contracts, a clause about exclusive supply agreements that required the farmer to purchase certain goods only from Harrington-controlled suppliers. That clause. That was the one that made her set down her pen and sit very still for a moment. Because that clause, if enforced, meant those farmers were paying Harrington twice. Once through the loan interest, once through the inflated supplier prices. And if they violated the clause, if they bought from someone cheaper, someone local, someone like the general store that James Miller's brother-in-law ran, Harrington could claim breach and accelerate. She thought about the repair work she'd been doing. The plows and the wagon wheels and the horseshoes and the harness buckles. She thought about the fact that she hadn't charged a cent for any of it. She thought about the fact that Harrington hadn't moved on her yet, and she thought about why, and she thought, he doesn't think I know what I know. He still thinks this is about a woman playing blacksmith. He still thinks this is a story about propriety and gender and a foolish wife embarrassing her husband. He doesn't know yet that it's a story about contracts. She picked her pen back up and kept writing. Thomas found her at 2 a.m. at the kitchen table, every lamp burning papers spread from one end to the other. He stood in the doorway in his boots and his shirt untucked and his hair not yet combed because he'd woken to the light under the door and come to check, and she didn't look up from the page she was writing. "Go to bed," she said. "What are you doing?" "Writing up a summary of what I've found in the contracts." "For who?" She paused, looked up. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But when we need it, I want it to be ready." He came in and sat down across from her, the way he always sat now, not asking permission, not making a production of it, just settling into the space the way you settle into something that has become familiar. He looked at the papers. He looked at her handwriting, which was small and precise, and covered the pages in neat columns. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. "What do you think he's going to do when he realizes what you've been doing in here? And I don't mean the forge." She set down her pen. She thought about Victor Harrington, about the particular coldness of men who see people as problems to be managed, about the way he'd gone to James Miller's kitchen and drunk his wife's coffee and smiled while he talked about calling a loan. "I think," she said carefully, "that he's going to try to make an example of someone. When a man like that feels his control slipping, he doesn't negotiate. He demonstrates what happens when you don't cooperate." She held his gaze. "I think the question is who he chooses." "And if it's us," Thomas asked. "Then we'll need what I'm writing," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had come up and was working at the corners of the house the way Montana wind does in November, not dramatic, just persistent, finding every gap. Thomas reached across the table and picked up one of the contracts she'd annotated, and he read through her notes, and then he set it down and said nothing for a while. "I need to tell you something," he said finally. She waited. "When I put that advertisement in the paper—" He stopped. Started again. "I was honest about the ranch, the size of it, the work. I was honest that I was a widower and that the house was big." He looked at his hands. "But I was not honest about why I was doing it. I told myself it was practical, that the ranch needed a woman's management, that I was getting on in years, and it made sense." He looked up. That was all true, but it wasn't the reason. Evelyn was still. "The reason," he said, "was that I had been alone for 6 years and I was tired of it. And I didn't know how to say that in a letter to a stranger, so I talked about the ranch instead." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Thomas." "Yes." "I answered an advertisement in a newspaper," she said, "from a man I'd never met to travel 2,000 miles to a place I'd never been." She paused. "Did you think I did that because I had better options?" He opened his mouth. "But I need you to understand," she continued, "that I did not do it because I was desperate. I did it because—" She stopped, looked at the forge, at the tools, at the life she had built in this shed. "Because I needed room, and this was the only offer that came with room." She met his eyes. "I am glad it was yours." Thomas Walker sat across from his wife at 2 in the morning with contracts spread between them, and a Montana wind finding every gap in the house, and he felt something shift in his chest, the ice-cracking thing, but further along this time, more of it giving way. "Get some sleep," he said. "You can finish this tomorrow." "In a minute," she said, and picked up her pen. He smiled. She didn't see it because she was already writing again, and he pushed back his chair and went back to bed and lay there listening to the wind and the faint scratch of her pen from down the hall, and felt for the first time in 6 years that the house was not empty. 3 days later, Victor Harrington came to the ranch himself. He came in a good carriage with a driver, which was his way of letting you know before he opened his mouth what kind of man he was. He was 50-something, well-dressed, with the careful good manners of a man who has learned that charm is a more efficient tool than aggression most of the time. Thomas met him in the yard. "Walker," Harrington said, climbing down from the carriage and extending his hand. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "What can I do for you, Victor?" Thomas said. He shook the hand, because you shook hands out here regardless of what you thought of the man. "Just a friendly visit. We've been neighbors a long time, and I realized I hadn't come out to meet your new wife." He smiled. "I heard she's quite the addition to the community." "She is," Thomas said. "I wonder if I might—" Harrington glanced toward the shed where the forge smoke was rising from the chimney. "Say hello." "You can say hello to me," Evelyn said. She had come around the corner of the shed without either of them hearing her, and she was wiping her hands on her work apron, and she was looking at Victor Harrington with the calm, measuring expression she brought to every new piece of metal, assessing weight and composition before she decided what it needed. Harrington turned. He took her in the apron, the calloused hands, the steadiness of her, and she could see him adjusting his calculation in real time. "Mrs. Walker," he said, and the smile stayed in place. "What a pleasure. I've been hearing so much about you." "I imagine you have," she said. "What can I do for you, Mr. Harrington?" He spread his hands in a generous gesture. "I just wanted to introduce myself, and perhaps have a conversation neighbor to neighbor about the work you've been doing." He paused. "I understand you've been offering services to some of the farming families in the area, blacksmith work, and other things." The emphasis on other things was subtle, but it was there. "I help my neighbors when they need help," she said. "Is there something wrong with that?" "Not at all. Not at all. I just want to make sure everyone understands the boundaries. Legally speaking, there are licensing requirements for commercial operations, and I'd hate for you to find yourself in a difficult position." Evelyn looked at him. "I appreciate your concern," she said, "and your expertise in legal matters. I've been doing some reading about legal matters myself lately." She smiled. It did not reach her eyes. It's fascinating how much clarity you can get just from reading carefully. Something moved behind Harrington's expression. Not much, he was too controlled for that, but something. "Well," he said, "I'll let you get back to your work." He turned back to Thomas. "Walker, always good." He climbed back into the carriage. Neither Thomas nor Evelyn spoke until the carriage had rolled out of the yard and down the road. Then Thomas said, "You told him." "I told him nothing he didn't already suspect," she said. "But now he knows I know, and now he has to decide what to do about it." She turned back toward the shed. "Which means we're about to find out what kind of man he really is." She was right. They found out 12 days later. It was Billy who came running in from the road at dawn, breathing hard, his face white under his tan, and he didn't stop at the house. He came straight to the shed because he had figured out by now that the shed was where things were decided. "Mrs. Walker," he said, and his voice was unsteady. "There's smoke coming from the Miller farm." Evelyn was off her stool before he finished the sentence. "Which building?" she said. "The barn, but Mrs. Walker—" He stopped, swallowed. "The word coming up the road is that it started in the wheat store, and the wheat store has a lock on it." His eyes met hers. "James Miller says he didn't leave it locked last night. The forge fire was still burning behind her, and the tools were laid out on the bench, and the morning light was just starting to come through the shed door, and Evelyn Carter stood in the middle of everything she had built and felt something go cold and precise inside her. 'Go get Thomas,' she said. Billy ran. She stood there for one moment, one breath, and then she picked up her hammer, set it deliberately on the bench, took off her apron, and walked out of the shed toward whatever was coming. The Miller farm was 3 miles east, and Thomas had the horses moving before Billy finished saddling them. Evelyn rode beside him without being asked. She had not ridden since Philadelphia, but her body remembered it the way bodies remember things learned young, and she kept pace with him on the road, while the smoke ahead of them thickened against the morning sky, and the smell of it reached them long before the farm came into view. They heard Sarah Miller before they saw the farm. Her voice carried across the open ground, not screaming, which would have been easier to hear, but something worse than screaming. The low, steady sound of a woman who has moved past hysteria into the flat country beyond it where shock lives. James Miller was at the well hauling water with 2 of his older children, and the look on his face when Thomas and Evelyn came riding up was the look of a man watching something he cannot stop. The barn was still burning at the back corner where the wheat store had been. The wheat, all of it, every bushel of the fall harvest that was supposed to carry his family through winter was gone. Evelyn was off her horse before it fully stopped. "James," she said. He turned to her. His eyes were red not from crying, but from smoke, and his hands were shaking in the particular way hands shake when a man is running on nothing but necessity. "It was set," he said. "The lock on the wheat store, I checked it last night, 9 o'clock I checked it because I always check it. This morning, it was on the inside of the door." "You're sure?" Thomas said. "I built that door," James said. "I know how that lock works." Thomas looked at Evelyn. She was already thinking. She could feel it happening the way she always felt it. Not as emotion, not yet, but as a kind of cold clarity that came in and pushed everything else aside, the way a good fire pushes out the cold. "Did anyone else have a key?" she asked. "My wife. Me. No one else." "Who knew where the wheat store was?" "Everyone who's ever been on this property." He laughed, and it was the wrong kind of laugh. "Harrington sat in my kitchen. He could see the barn from the window." Evelyn nodded once. "All right," she said. "All right, James. All right." His voice broke on the word. "Mrs. Walker, that was everything. That was the whole harvest. Without that wheat, we don't have feed for the animals through winter. Without feed—" He stopped. "I've got 4 children." "I know," she said. "I know you do." "He did this," James said. "He burned it because I came to you. Because I didn't do what he told me to do." "Yes," Evelyn said. She didn't soften it. She had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you could do for someone in the moment of a real blow was pretend it hadn't landed. "I believe he did. and we are going to do something about that." She held his gaze. "But right now what we are going to do first is get your family through winter. You hear me? That comes first. Everything else comes after." He stared at her. Then he said, "How?" "Let me work on that," she said. "You put out what's left of that fire." She turned back to Thomas. He was already looking at her with the expression she'd seen more and more lately, not surprise anymore, just a kind of steady attention, like a man watching someone do something that requires his complete focus. "The Walker Ranch has grain stores," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "How much can you spare?" He didn't hesitate. "Enough." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "We're going to need more than enough." He understood what she meant. The other farms. He didn't just burn Miller's wheat, she said. He burned it where everyone could see the smoke. Every farmer who's been coming to me, every one of them, is looking at that smoke right now and thinking about their own wheat store, their own barns, their own loans. She kept her voice low. He's not trying to destroy James Miller. He's trying to frighten everyone else into going home. Thomas looked at the smoke. Looked at James Miller, at the well hauling water with his children. Looked back at his wife. "Then we make sure they don't go home," he said. Evelyn was back at the Walker Ranch by noon, but she didn't go to the shed. She went to the kitchen, and she sent Billy with the wagon to 3 farms with a message written in her own hand, and she sat at the table and started writing a different kind of document than the contract summary she'd been compiling for the past weeks. What she was writing now was a record, dates, names, what had been brought to her, what she had observed, what James Miller had told her about Harrington's visit, the condition of the lock on the wheat store door. Every conversation she had documented in her notes over the past 2 months, now organized into a single coherent account. She was halfway through it when the first farmer arrived. Ed Pruitt, 43 years old with a loan through Harrington's bank and a supply agreement that was one of the 3 she'd identified as genuinely problematic. He came into the kitchen without knocking. Nobody knocked anymore, which she had noticed and chosen not to address because there was something she valued about it, and he said, "I heard about Miller's wheat." "Sit down, Ed," she said and kept writing. He sat. He watched her write. After a minute he said, "Harrington sent me a letter this morning, before the fire, hand-delivered at dawn. Said he'd been looking at the supply clause in my contract, and he was concerned I might be in breach." Evelyn's pen didn't stop moving. "What time was the fire?" Ed blinked. What time did the Miller barn start burning?" He thought about it. "Billy came to me around 6, so before 6, maybe 5:35. And Harrington's letter arrived at dawn, which in November is 6:30, Ed said slowly. "Maybe 7. She looked up from her writing. "He sent the letters before the fire was visible from town." The kitchen went very quiet. Ed sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "He planned it. The fire and the letters together. Burn the example, then send the warning." "That's what it looks like," she said. "Can you prove it?" "Not yet," she said. "But that's what I'm working on." She set down her pen. "Ed, did anyone else get a letter this morning?" He nodded. "Frank Dawes, maybe others. We were talking on the road when I came here." "Go get Frank," she said. "Get anyone else who got a letter today. Bring them here." "And then what?" "And then you let me do what I've been doing," she said, "and you trust that it's going somewhere." He looked at her for a long moment. The same way Frank Dawes had looked at her that first night in this kitchen, the assessing look of a man deciding whether trust is a reasonable investment. Then he got up and went out the door. By 3 in the afternoon, there were 6 men sitting in Evelyn's kitchen, and Thomas had quietly moved to the doorway to make room, and the table was covered in letters and contracts and Evelyn's handwritten notes, and she stood at the head of it all and walked them through what she'd found. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't use extra words. She showed them the clauses, explained what they meant and what they didn't mean, told them which of them Harrington had actual leverage over and which of them he was bluffing with. He burned Miller's wheat, she said, because he needed a demonstration. He needed everyone in this county to see what happens when you don't cooperate. But demonstrations only work if people believe they're inevitable. If enough of you hold together, if you don't scatter, if you don't each go running back to him separately to try to save yourselves, he has no demonstration. He just has a crime. That's a crime already, Frank Dawes said, and his voice had changed since that first night. Burning a man's harvest. Yes, Evelyn said. It is. Which means we need the sheriff. The men exchanged looks. Hector Cole isn't going to move against Harrington without evidence, Ed Pruitt said. Harrington's got money in this county. Money means influence. I know, Evelyn said. Which is why we're not going to go to Cole with a story. We're going to go to him with a document. She held up the papers she'd been writing all morning. Everything I have, organized, dated, witnessed. She looked around the table. How many of you are willing to sign your name to what you've told me? Silence. Then James Miller, who had come in an hour ago with smoke still in his clothes, with Sarah at home with the children, and nowhere to put his grief except into the decision in front of him, said, I'll sign. Ed Pruitt said, I'll sign. Frank Dawes, who had walked into this kitchen 2 weeks ago with his arms crossed and his trust locked up tight, said, I'll sign. God help me, I'll sign. One by one around the table. All 6. Thomas from the doorway said nothing. But his face said something, and Evelyn saw it, and she filed it away in the part of her that was not the cold, clear working part, the part that was still and always. Her father's daughter standing in a workshop, learning that the best things are made by people who know their own hands. Sheriff Hector Cole was a deliberate man. That was the polite way to describe him. The less polite way was that he moved slow and thought slow and had an ingrained preference for the status quo that had served him reasonably well in a town where the status quo hadn't until now required anyone to look too hard at Victor Harrington. He came to the Walker Ranch 2 days after Evelyn sent word, and he came alone, which told her something, and he sat at her kitchen table and read through the document she'd prepared with the careful expression of a man who is hoping to find a reason to put it down. He didn't find one. This is... He stopped, cleared his throat. This is a substantial document, Mrs. Walker. Yes, she said. You have statements from 6 men. Yes. And these contract annotations, you did these yourself? Yes. He looked at her over the top of the papers. You have legal training. I have a father who made me read everything he signed, she said, and 30 years of paying attention. Cole set the papers down. He looked at Thomas, who was sitting at the other end of the table with his coffee and his silence. Walker, you're behind this. My wife brought it together, Thomas said. I'm behind my wife. Cole picked up the papers again, read through another page, set them down. The fire, he said. There's no direct evidence connecting Harrington. The timing of the letters, Evelyn said. Circumstantial. The lock on the inside of the door. Could have been a mistake. Could have been, she agreed, but wasn't. And you know that, Sheriff, because you're a man who's been doing this job long enough to know the difference between a coincidence and a pattern. Cole looked at her for a long moment. He had the particular expression of a man who is being asked to do something harder than he would like, and who is trying to find a way to want to do it. If I go to Harrington with this, he said slowly, and I can't make it stick, then nothing changes, Evelyn said. He keeps his loans, he keeps his supply contracts, he burns the next barn, and sends the next letters, and 6 months from now, there are 3 fewer farms in this county, and Victor Harrington has bought them all at foreclosure prices. She leaned forward. But if you do nothing, if you look at this document and decide it's not enough, then you've made a decision. You just need to be honest with yourself that you've made it. The kitchen was very quiet. Cole sat with her words for a long moment. Then he said, I need to talk to James Miller myself. He's expecting you, she said. He stood up, put on his hat, picked up the document. I'm not promising anything, Mrs. Walker. I know, she said. But you're taking the papers. He walked out without answering, which was itself an answer. Thomas waited until the sound of Cole's horse faded down the road. Then he said, You think he'll move? I think he's scared, she said. I think he's a man who's been comfortable for a long time, and he doesn't love what comfort has cost him, but he doesn't know how to pay the bill yet. She started gathering the remaining papers from the table. But he took the document, and he's going to Miller. That means he's at least walking toward the door. And if he doesn't go through it, she didn't answer immediately. She stacked the papers, neatly squared the edges the way her father had taught her to keep a workspace, everything in its place, everything accounted for, because the mess you allow on the bench is the mess that ends up in your work. Then we find another door, she said. She didn't sleep much that night. She wasn't anxious, or she was, but not in the way that freezes people. She was anxious the way a forge is anxious, the way heat builds under pressure and needs somewhere to go. She lay in the dark and thought about Harrington, about Cole, about the 6 men who had signed their names and were now sleeping in houses they might lose if this went wrong. And she thought about her father, who had trusted the wrong document, and she thought about the difference between his situation and theirs, and the difference was her. It was the work she had done for the past 2 months. Not the forge work, not the repairs, but the reading and the writing and the sitting across kitchen tables from frightened men and translating the language of power back into something they could use. That was the other inheritance her father had left her. Not just the tools, the way of seeing. 2 days passed without word from Cole. On the 3rd day, Coleman came. Not with a complaint this time. He came at noon on foot without his hat, which meant he'd left his shop in a hurry, and the hat had been an afterthought he'd forgotten. He knocked on the front door of the house, and when Evelyn opened it, she could see immediately that something had happened. "He went to Harrington," Coleman said. "Cole, yesterday, with your papers." She stood very still. "How do you know?" "Because Harrington came to my shop this morning and told me." Coleman's face was doing something complicated, not the red anger she'd seen before, but something more unsettled, like a man who's found something unexpected under a rock he's been sitting on. He wanted me to make a statement, saying that you'd been running an illegal competing operation, taking my customers by undercutting prices." He stopped. "He said it would help establish that you had an improper commercial enterprise on the Walker property. Give him grounds to go after Thomas on some kind of county ordinance violation." Evelyn kept her face neutral. "And what did you say?" Coleman looked at the ground, looked at her. "I said I'd think about it," he said. "And then I came here." She waited. "He burned Miller's wheat," Coleman said, "and it came out rough. I didn't know, I suspected, but I didn't." He stopped again, started over. "I've been in this town 11 years. I've watched him squeeze people. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself the farmers knew what they were getting into when they took his money." His jaw worked. "James Miller has been coming to my shop since I opened. He never once tried to cheat me. He paid what he owed every time, even when times were hard. And Harrington burned his wheat." "Yes," Evelyn said. "He did." "You didn't steal my customers," Coleman said. It cost him something to say it. She could tell. "I know I said you did, but what I meant was that I was angry someone was better at it than me and I wanted someone to blame." He looked up. "The farmers who came to you, most of them couldn't afford to wait for me or pay my prices. I knew that. I just didn't. I told myself that wasn't my problem." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do about Harrington's request?" "I'm not going to do it," he said. "But Mrs. Walker, that's not why I'm here." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. When he asked me to make a statement, he told me what he'd already told Cole. He told me what he plans to say, that the contract with Miller allowed early acceleration, that the fire was accidental, that you've been running an unlicensed business. He held out the paper. I wrote it down. Everything he told me to say in the order he told me to say it. If he's prepared that story, you need to know what it is. Evelyn took the paper, opened it, read it. She read it twice. Then she said, "Coleman." "Yes, ma'am." "Would you be willing to sign a statement about this conversation? What Harrington asked you to do, and what you observed?" He was quiet for a moment. She could see him understanding what that meant. What it would cost him, what it would mean for a small-town blacksmith to put his name on a document against the most powerful man in the county. "I've been the only game in town for 11 years, he said finally. "Turns out that made me lazy." He looked at her steadily. "Yes, ma'am. I'll sign." That afternoon, Evelyn sent Billy back to Hector Cole's office with a new addition to the document: Coleman's signed statement about Harrington's request for false testimony. Cole came to the ranch himself the next morning, and this time he didn't sit down. "He asked a man to lie," Cole said. "To a law officer," Evelyn said, "in connection with an active inquiry." Cole put his hat on and took it off again. That's a different matter than disputed contract language." "Yes," she said. "It is. I need to bring this to the territorial judge." He said it with the voice of a man who has walked through the door he'd been standing in front of for 3 days. "Judge Harlan is due in the territory next month, November 22nd. "That's 4 weeks, Thomas said. "Yes." Cole looked at them both. 4 weeks where I need everyone who signed that document to stay quiet and stay careful. Can you guarantee that?" "No," Evelyn said, "but I can talk to them." "Talk to them?" he said. "And Mrs. Walker." He paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I should have moved sooner." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He went. Thomas let out a long breath. 4 weeks, he said. 4 weeks, she agreed. They made it 3. The fire that took the shed came on a Thursday night in the second week of November, and it came fast. Too fast, which was itself a signature, the same signature as Miller's barn. Only quieter, designed to look like an accident, a spark from the forge that had been banked but not watched. Except the forge had been cold for 6 hours. Thomas smelled it first. He came out of a dead sleep at 2 in the morning and was out the door before he was fully awake, and Billy and the other ranch hands were already at the well, and they worked until dawn, but the shed was already gone before the first bucket reached it. Evelyn stood at the edge of what remained while Thomas put his hand on her shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The tools were gone. The workbench. The forge she'd rebuilt with her own hands. The roof she'd repaired board by board in the September heat. All of it. She stood there for a long time. Thomas kept his hand on her shoulder and waited. When she finally spoke, her voice was level. "He's scared," she said. "Evelyn, no, I mean it. He burned the shed because the document scared him. Because Coleman scared him. He's not controlling this anymore, and he knows it." She turned to look at the house, looked back at the smoking wreckage. "He made a mistake." "He destroyed everything you built," Thomas said, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard before, not anger exactly, but the near side of it. The tight, low register of a man who is holding something in very carefully. "He destroyed wood and iron," she said. "He didn't destroy the document. He didn't destroy Coleman's statement. He didn't destroy the 6 names." She reached into her apron pocket and held up a key. "And he didn't destroy my father's tools. I moved them to the house 2 days ago, when I started thinking he might try something like this." Thomas stared at the key, then at her. "You knew," he said. "I suspected," she said. "There's a difference." She closed her fingers around the key. "Come inside. We need to send word to Cole first thing, and then—" She looked back at the wreckage one more time, and something moved across her face that wasn't grief and wasn't anger, but was the particular expression of a person whose resolve has just been removed of its last uncertainty. "And then we need to start talking to the families about what comes next." She walked back toward the house, and Thomas fell into step beside her, and when he reached out and took her hand, she let him, and they walked like that through the cold dark of the Montana morning, and the smoke from what Harrington had burned rose behind them, and neither of them looked back. But in the kitchen, on the table under a lamp that had been burning all night, the document was still there. Every page of it. Intact. Cole's deputy rode out before sunrise. Evelyn heard the horse coming up the road while the coffee was still brewing, and she was at the front door before he knocked, because she had slept poorly and spent the dark hours between 2 and 5 lying awake, listening to the wind, and running through every variable she could think of. The way you check a piece of metal before you commit it to the fire, looking for the flaw, the hidden crack, the place where it might give under pressure. The deputy's name was Garrett Young, 22 maybe, with the uncomfortable expression of a man delivering news he doesn't fully understand. He handed her a folded note and said, "Sheriff Cole asks that you come to town this morning, ma'am. Him and Judge Harlan both." Evelyn unfolded the note, read it once. "Judge Harlan arrived early," she said. "Yes, ma'am, 3 days early. He came in on last night's stage." She looked up. "Does Harrington know the judge is here?" Garrett shifted his weight. "That I couldn't say, ma'am." She could say. Harrington had money in the stage line, which meant he had eyes on who wrote it, which meant he knew, before Cole did, that Harlan had arrived early, which meant whatever move he was planning it now this morning, in the hours before anyone had time to organize. "Tell the sheriff we'll be there in 40 minutes, she said. She closed the door and turned around, and Thomas was already at the bottom of the stairs with his boots on. "I heard," he said. "We need to move," she said. She went to the kitchen table and picked up the document. All of it, the contract analyses, the signed statements. Coleman's account, her own written record of dates and conversations, and she checked it against the inventory she had memorized, the same way she'd memorized her father's tool count, because you don't leave things to chance when things matter. Every page was there. She put it in the leather satchel Thomas had bought her in October, the one she'd initially said she didn't need, and had been using every day since. "The tools," Thomas said. "In the trunk in our room," she said. "They're not going anywhere." "I meant..." He stopped. "I meant, are you all right?" She looked at him. He was standing there with his hat in his hand, and his coat half-buttoned, and his face doing the thing it did now when he wasn't trying to manage what it showed, which was a thing she had come to trust more than most people's careful expressions. "Ask me that tonight," she said. "Right now, I need to get to town." He put his hat on. "Then let's go." The ride to Willow Creek took 35 minutes because Thomas pushed the horses, and Evelyn spent most of it going over the document in her head, not because she doubted what was in it, but because preparation was the only thing she knew how to do with fear. Her father had taught her that. You don't get rid of fear by telling yourself you're not afraid. You get rid of it by making sure you've done the work. She had done the work. Willow Creek, on a Thursday morning in late November, had a particular quality. The cold had settled in, and the streets were mostly quiet. At this hour, the kind of quiet that makes every sound carry farther than it should. She heard voices from the direction of Cole's office before they reached it, and one of those voices was elevated in the specific way of a man who is accustomed to being the loudest person in any room. Thomas tied the horses and put his hand briefly on the small of her back, not steering her, just marking that he was there. And she walked through the door of the sheriff's office with the satchel over her shoulder, and her chin at the angle that had puzzled the women of Willow Creek on the day she arrived, and that had not changed once since. Victor Harrington was already there, ready. He was standing near Cole's desk with a man Evelyn didn't recognize. 50s, silver-haired, the kind of expensive suit that announced itself from across a room. His lawyer, she understood immediately, brought in for exactly this occasion. Sheriff Cole was behind his desk with the expression of a man who has been awake since before dawn, managing a situation that had gotten complicated faster than he'd planned. And in the chair beside the window sat a man she knew must be Judge Harlan, compact gray, with the particular stillness of someone who has spent 40 years listening to people talk and has long since learned to wait until they're finished. Harrington turned when she walked in. His face did something very controlled and very brief, a recalibration the same one she'd seen in the shed that first morning when he'd expected one thing and encountered another. "Mrs. Walker," he said, and his voice was warm as a winter sun. "I didn't know you'd be joining us." "Mr. Harrington," she said. She looked at Cole. "You sent for me, Sheriff." "I did," Cole said. He had the look of a man who has made his decision and is living with the weight of it. Judge Harlan arrived last evening. Given the nature of the evidence you provided, he asked to meet this morning before any formal proceedings. He glanced at Harrington. Mr. Harrington was informed and chose to attend. Of course, Harrington said. He spread his hands in the generous gesture she recognized from his visit to the ranch. I have nothing to hide, and I have to say. He looked at Evelyn with the patient expression of a man explaining something to someone who means well, but doesn't understand the full picture. I'm concerned that my neighbor has been given some incorrect information about the nature of his business dealings with the county's farming families. I'd hate for a misunderstanding to cause unnecessary alarm. Judge Harlan had not moved or spoken. He was watching Harrington the way you watch a card player. Not the cards, the hands. Evelyn set her satchel on the edge of Cole's desk and opened it. Your Honor, she said, addressing Harlan directly. My name is Evelyn Walker. I've spent the past 2 months reviewing loan contracts held by Victor Harrington against 11 farming families in this county. I have documented irregularities in 7 of those contracts, a pattern of intimidation against borrowers who sought outside assistance, the burning of James Miller's harvest in what I believe was a deliberate act of coercion, and a request made by Mr. Harrington to Richard Coleman, the town's blacksmith, to provide false testimony in connection with this inquiry. She placed the document on the desk. This is a written account of all of it. It's been signed by 6 of the affected farmers, by Mr. Coleman, and by myself. The room was very still. Harrington's lawyer leaned toward his client and said something in a low voice. Harrington put his hand up slightly, a small gesture, the kind that means, I have this, and looked at Evelyn with the expression she had been waiting for since that first visit to the ranch. Not the charm now, not the warmth. The thing underneath which was cooler and harder and considerably more honest. Mrs. Walker, he said, has clearly been very busy, and I admire industry in a woman. But I think what we have here is a situation where someone without legal training has looked at a set of complex financial documents and reached some understandable but ultimately incorrect conclusions. He looked at Harlan. My attorney has reviewed the relevant contracts. The provisions Mrs. Walker is concerned about are entirely standard in commercial lending. As for the fire, a tragic accident. The Miller Properties barn has had maintenance issues for years. I'd be happy to provide testimony to that effect. Would you? Evelyn said. He looked at her. Because that's interesting, she said, given that you've already asked Richard Coleman to provide testimony. And he declined. And then he came and told me about it. She opened the satchel again and took out a single-page Coleman signed statement, which she set on top of the main document. In detail. Harrington's lawyer said something else louder this time. Harrington didn't look at him. He was looking at Evelyn. And for the first time since she'd met him, she could see him thinking, actually thinking, working through the variables she'd introduced, calculating. Coleman, he said, and the warmth was entirely gone now, has had a difficult few months. He's been under a great deal of competitive pressure. I'm not sure his account of any conversation would be reliable, Judge Harlan said. Everyone looked at him. It was the first word he'd spoken since Evelyn walked in, and he said it in the tone of a man who has been in courtrooms for 40 years and knows exactly what it sounds like when someone questions a witness's credibility without cause. I was going to say, objective, Your Honor, Harrington said. Of course you were, Harlan said. He picked up the document from the desk. He didn't rush. He turned to the first page and read with the deliberate attention of a man who reads for precision, not speed. The room held its breath around him. Thomas had come to stand slightly behind Evelyn and to her right, and she was aware of him there, the way you're aware of solid ground, not thinking about it, just knowing it's under you. Harrington's lawyer began to speak something about jurisdiction, about the informal nature of the proceeding, about the impropriety of reviewing documents without Harlan, lifted one finger without looking up from the page, and the lawyer stopped. Harlan read for 4 minutes. Nobody moved. Then he set the document down and looked at Harrington. Mr. Harrington, he said, in your opinion, does the definition of material default in the Miller contract allow you to accelerate the loan based on the borrower purchasing services from a non-approved provider? Harrington's jaw was set. My attorney believes there is a reasonable interpretation of the language that— I didn't ask what your attorney believes, Harlan said. I asked what you believe. A silence. I believe the contract provides certain protections for the lender, Harrington said carefully. Yes, Harlan said. I can read that it does. I can also read what those protections specifically apply to. And purchasing a blacksmithing service is not among them. He looked at the lawyer. You reviewed these contracts. The lawyer said, Your Honor, in the context of the full agreement. Yes or no, Harlan said. Yes, Your Honor. And you advised your client that he had grounds for acceleration based on Miller's use of a non-approved blacksmith. The lawyer's face changed slightly. I advised that there was a possible interpretation. Possible, Harlan repeated. He looked at Harrington. Here is where we are, Mr. Harrington. I have a document prepared by a private citizen that demonstrates clearly and specifically the correct interpretation of these contracts. I have signed statements from 6 farmers and a local businessman. I have a record of a fire that destroyed a farmer's entire harvest 2 days after that farmer declined to comply with a demand from you. He paused. I do not have direct evidence connecting you to that fire. Yet. He let the word sit there, the same word Evelyn had used on that first night in the shed, and it had exactly the same weight. What I do have is sufficient cause to begin a formal inquiry, which I am doing, as of this morning. Harrington stood very still. You'll want to speak to your attorney, Harlan said. I'd suggest doing so promptly. Harrington looked at Evelyn. Not at Cole, not at Thomas, not at Harlan. At Evelyn. And what was in his face was not the anger she might have expected, but something colder and more specific, the expression of a man who has identified the source of the problem with a precision that is in its own way a kind of acknowledgement. She held his gaze. He picked up his hat from Cole's desk. It was the only thing in his bearing that gave him away. The slightly too fast movement of a man who is leaving before he means to, and he walked out. His lawyer followed, talking in a low, urgent voice, before the door had even closed. The room let out its collective breath. Cole said, Well. Harlan set the document down and looked at Evelyn. Who taught you to read a contract, Mrs. Walker? My father, she said. He did a good job, Harlan said. She felt something move through her at that, something she hadn't expected, a heat behind her eyes that she controlled by looking at the floor for exactly 1 second and then back up. He did, she said. Thomas put his hand on her shoulder. She didn't move away from it. The inquiry took 10 days to open formally, and those 10 days were some of the most difficult Evelyn had navigated since arriving in Montana. Not because of the legal process, that part she understood well enough, and she spent long evenings with the document and with Harlan's preliminary questions, preparing the kind of clear, specific answers that legal proceedings needed. The difficult part was the town. Because Willow Creek was a place where Victor Harrington had been a fixed point of the landscape for 12 years, and fixed points don't move without taking things with them. There were people in that town who had benefited from his presence, not from his loans, which were always a kind of trap, but from his patronage, his business, the way his money moved through the local economy. The general store owner who depended on supply contracts he controlled. The hotel proprietor who hosted his business dinners. The men who worked for his suppliers and whose wages, however unfair, came from his pockets. These people did not come to Evelyn's kitchen. They watched from their stores and their houses and their side of the street, and she felt their watching the way you feel, whether not on your face yet, but in the quality of the air. Martha Greaves stopped Evelyn on the boardwalk on the 4th day. I want to ask you something, Martha said, and her voice had lost its previous certainty, which was itself notable. People are saying Harrington might lose everything, the bank accounts, the property holdings, all of it. I don't know what he'll lose, Evelyn said. That depends on what the inquiry finds. But the farms, Martha said. The loans he holds, if his operation is dismantled, who holds those loans? Evelyn looked at her. She understood what Martha was actually asking, not about justice, but about stability. About what happened to a town when its financial architecture collapsed. That's a legitimate concern, Evelyn said. And it's being discussed. Judge Harlan has already reached out to the Territory Bank about assuming the loans at the existing terms. No acceleration, no new conditions. The farmers would owe the same amounts on the same schedules, just to a different holder. Martha absorbed this. You thought about that already. I thought about it before I went to Cole, Evelyn said. You can't pull a support out of a structure without knowing what holds it up. Martha looked at her for a long moment. She had the expression of a woman reassessing a calculation she'd made in July, which was Evelyn knew one of the harder things a person could be asked to do. I said things when you arrived, Martha said finally. Things that weren't kind. Yes, Evelyn said. You did. Martha pressed her lips together. It was the closest she could come Evelyn understood to what needed to be said, and she decided to let it be enough. The Territory Bank arrangement, Martha said. Is that settled? Not yet, but it will be. Martha nodded once the tight nod of a woman filing something away and walked back into her store. James Miller came to the ranch on the 7th day. He came in the afternoon alone with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was different from every other look she'd seen there. Not the fear of the first morning, not the brittle determination of the kitchen meeting, not the raw devastation of the fire. This was something quieter. He sat in the kitchen and she brought him coffee, and he held the cup for a moment before he said anything. I want you to know something, he said. She waited. When Harrington came to my kitchen that first time, and he sat there and talked about the loan, He stopped, started again. I didn't sleep for 3 nights. I lay awake thinking about what I would do, how I would tell Sarah, how I would tell the children. He looked at the coffee cup. I thought about packing, just packing and going, somewhere else, somewhere he didn't have a reach. But you came back to the shed, Evelyn said. I came back to the shed, he said. Because I'd already been to the shed, because I'd watched you fix that wheel. And I thought... He stopped again, and she could see him trying to find the right words for something that lived below the level where words usually reach. I thought if a woman who'd been mocked by this entire town from the moment she stepped off the stage could rebuild a broken shed with her own 2 hands and fix what nobody else would fix, then maybe I didn't have to run. He looked up. That's what I wanted you to know. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. James, she said, you came back because you were brave. No, ma'am, he said. I came back because you gave me a reason to be. She didn't have an answer for that. She picked up her coffee and held it and looked out the kitchen window at the place where the shed had stood at the cleared ground and the faint scorch marks still visible in the dirt. And she thought about her father and about what it meant to leave something behind in the people you helped. Something that kept working after the original thing was gone. Your harvest, she said finally. The winter stores. You're settled for the season. Thomas's grain and what the other farmers brought over, he said. We're more than settled. Sarah said... He stopped, and the corners of his eyes went tight. Sarah said to tell you that she baked something for you. She'll bring it over on Sunday. Evelyn nodded. Tell her I'll put the kettle on. He left. She stayed at the kitchen table for a long time after he was gone. When Thomas came in an hour later, he found her there with her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee and a look on her face he'd seen once before in the shed. The first night he'd brought her coffee when he'd asked about her father, and she'd told him about the tools, and he'd seen for the first time what it looked like when someone was feeling several things at once and managing them the way you manage a fire carefully with both hands. He refilled her cup without asking, sat down across from her. Miller go okay, he said. Yes, she said. He waited. I've been sitting here thinking about whether I did the right thing, she said. Coming here. The letter. All of it. She looked at him. Not because of the fire or Harrington. That's not what I mean. She turned the cup in her hands. I mean I made decisions I didn't tell you about. The contracts. Talking to the farmers. Moving in a direction that put your ranch at risk without... I didn't ask you. I should have asked you. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Evelyn, he said, I know we had an arrangement. I know what the letter said and what it didn't say, and "Evelyn," he said again, and his voice had something in it that stopped her. "Do you know why I haven't said a word about any of it? Not the contracts, not the farmers in the kitchen, not any of it." She looked at him. "Because the second week you were here," he said, "I came out to the shed and I watched you work, and I watched you talk to Miller, and I thought this woman knows exactly what she's doing, and whatever she's doing, I want to be on the right side of it." He set down his cup. "That's not a man letting his wife do what she wants. That's a man choosing who he stands with." She looked at him for a long time. "You could have said that," she said. "I thought I was showing it," he said. "You were," she said. "I just needed to hear it once." He nodded. "Noted?" He picked up his coffee. "For the record, the ranch is fine, and even if it wasn't, I'd make the same call." She breathed out. Something she'd been carrying shifted. Not gone, she'd been carrying it her whole life in one form or another, but redistributed the way weight redistributes when someone else puts their hand to the other side of it. "I want to rebuild the shed," she said. "I know," he said. "Bigger this time. Proper foundation. I want to be able to take on actual work, not just favors for neighbors, real work, paid work, a licensed operation." She looked at him. "I know that's not what you advertised for." He looked at her across the kitchen table. This woman who had arrived in a faded dress with one wooden trunk and a secret in a false bottom, who had repaired his books and his fences and his failing ranch accounts before he'd even fully understood she was doing it. Who had read 11 contracts and written a document that a territorial judge had picked up and acted on, who had stood in front of Victor Harrington in his own sheriff's office and put a single page on a desk and watched the room change. "What I advertised for," he said, "was a wife. What I got was considerably more than that." He paused. "I think the ranch can accommodate a licensed operation." She almost smiled. "You think?" "I'm fairly certain," he said. "The numbers support it." And there it was, the thing between them that had been building since the first morning with the coffee, since the kitchen table at 2 a.m, since the hand on her shoulder in Cole's office, since all the small accumulating moments of a real thing being built, not through speeches or declarations, but through the particular dailiness of two people choosing over and over to stand on the same side. The formal hearing before Judge Harlan took place on November 22nd, as originally scheduled. The courthouse in Willow Creek held 40 people comfortably and 60 uncomfortably, and it held 83 on that morning, with more standing outside the door and along the wall, and the quality of silence in that room. Before Harlan called it to order was the specific silence of a community waiting to find out what it was. Evelyn sat at the front table with Sheriff Cole and James Miller. Thomas sat in the row directly behind her, and behind him sat Ed Pruitt and Frank Dawes, and the other farmers, and behind them, in the middle of the room, sat Richard Coleman with his hat on his knee, and none of them looked at each other, because they didn't need to. Victor Harrington sat at the opposite table with his attorney. His bearing was immaculate. His suit was expensive. He had spent 12 years in this county building, the appearance of a man whose position was unassailable, and he was not going to abandon that appearance now. Harlan called the hearing to order. The formal proceeding was not a trial, not yet. It was an inquiry, which meant Harlan was gathering testimony and evidence to determine whether criminal charges and civil remedies were warranted. What this meant in practice was that people stood up and said what they knew, and Harlan asked questions, and Harrington's attorney objected to various things, and Harlan sustained some objections, and overruled others, with the even-handed patience of a man who has been doing this for 4 decades and is not impressed by either side's theatrics. James Miller testified first. He told his story plainly: the loan, the visit, the fire, the lock. And when Harrington's attorney cross-examined him and suggested that the lock might have been misremembered, James said, "I built that door myself, with my own hands. I know how that lock works." And there was a murmur in the room that Harlan quieted with a look. Ed Pruitt testified. Frank Dawes testified, and he was unexpectedly concise and effective on the stand. Frank Dawes stripping everything down to fact and saying it straight without decoration. Then Coleman testified. He walked to the front of the room, and he sat down, and he said in the kind of voice that comes from a man who has made peace with an uncomfortable truth, "Mr. Harrington came to my shop on the morning of the fire, before the smoke was visible from town. He asked me to provide a statement saying that Mrs. Walker had been running an illegal competing operation and undercutting my prices. He told me what to say, and in what order to say it." He paused. "I said I'd think about it. Then I went to Mrs. Walker and told her everything." Harrington's attorney was on his feet. "Your Honor, this witness has a clear financial motivation." "Sit down, Counselor," Harlan said. He looked at Coleman. "Mr. Coleman, at the time Mr. Harrington made this request, were you under any financial obligation to him?" "No, Your Honor." "Were you under any legal obligation to comply?" "No, Your Honor." "Did you comply?" "No, Your Honor." "Thank you," Harlan said. "You may step down." Then Harlan called Evelyn. She walked to the front of the room and sat down and felt the room settle around her the way a room settles when it has identified the center of things. She was aware of Thomas behind her. She was aware of the farmers. She was aware of Martha Greaves sitting 3 rows back with her hands folded and her face in an expression that had given up its former certainty in favor of something more complicated and more honest. Harlan asked her to walk through the document. She did. Methodically, precisely the way her father had taught her to explain work, not trying to impress anyone, just showing what you'd done and how you'd done it and what it meant. She went through the contracts, the clauses the pattern sheet identified across 7 of the 11 documents. She explained the exclusive supply agreements and what they meant in practice, the double charging, the manufactured breach provisions. She explained the timeline of the intimidation from the first visit to Miller's kitchen to the letters sent the morning of the fire. "And the fire itself," Harlan said. "What is your conclusion regarding its cause?" "I believe it was set deliberately," she said, "as was the fire that destroyed the workshop on our property. The same night, same methodology, both fires burned faster than an accidental fire would, and neither had an organic ignition source present." Harrington's attorney objected on the grounds that Mrs. Walker was not a fire investigator. Harlan looked at her. "What is the basis for your assessment of fire behavior, Mrs. Walker?" 20 years of working with fire in a forge," she said. "I know what it does when it starts naturally, and I know what it does when someone helps it." Harlan sustained the testimony. It was when she was stepping down from the stand that the twist came, and it came from a direction nobody in that room had anticipated. A man stood up in the back row. He was nobody she recognized. 50s gray coat, the particular bearing of someone who has traveled a long distance recently and hasn't fully settled from it. He said, "Your Honor, if I may." Harlan looked at him. "Who are you, sir?" "My name is Arthur Renfield," the man said. "I'm an investigator with the Territorial Attorney's Office. I've been in Willow Creek for 4 days." He paused. "At the request of a bank in St. Louis, which has been conducting its own inquiry into Mr. Harrington's financial activities for the past 18 months. The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. Harrington went very still. "What is the nature of that inquiry?" Harlan said. Renfield walked toward the front of the room. He had a leather case under his arm. "The bank in St. Louis financed Mr. Harrington's original venture here in 1872. Over the past 3 years, they've identified irregularities in the profit distributions from his Montana holdings, specifically properties acquired through foreclosure, that were resold at values significantly below market, with the difference appearing in a separate set of accounts." He set the case on the edge of Harlan's table. "Mr. Harrington has been running a secondary operation. The loans were designed to fail. The contracts were written to manufacture breach. The goal was never to collect interest, it was to acquire the land." The room erupted. Harlan called it to order twice before the noise subsided. Harrington's attorney was on his feet saying something rapid and urgent, and Harrington himself was sitting very still, with the face of a man who has had the particular experience of watching something he thought was controlled become the opposite of controlled, and who is now running the calculations of containment and finding that the numbers don't work. Evelyn sat in her chair and felt Thomas's hand briefly on her shoulder. He'd leaned forward from the row behind, and she thought that's why the clauses were the same. That's why 7 out of 11 contracts had the same language. It wasn't just intimidation, it was a system. A designed system for taking land, and the farmers were never meant to survive it. The inquiry adjourned for the day and reconvened the next morning with Renfield's materials entered into the record and Harrington's attorney requesting a continuance that Harlan denied. What came out over the next 3 days was the full picture, and it was uglier than even Evelyn had suspected. Victor Harrington had come to Montana in 1872 with money borrowed from a St. Louis bank against a promise of return. He had built his operation carefully, the appearance of a legitimate lender, the cultivated relationships, the good manners, and the community presence, while systematically writing contracts designed to trap borrowers in manufactured defaults that he could trigger at will. The land he acquired through foreclosure went into a separate holding company. The St. Louis bank's returns were paid from the operating accounts while the real profit accumulated elsewhere. It was, Renfield explained, the kind of fraud that required patience and a convincing surface, which was why it had taken 18 months to identify, and why a private citizen in Willow Creek had gotten there first, because she'd been looking at the right level, not at the financial architecture, but at the specific language of specific contracts. Harlan looked at Evelyn when Renfield said that, and he said nothing, but his expression said something. The hearing concluded on the 3rd day. Harrington was taken into custody, pending the territorial attorney's formal charges, which Renfield indicated would be substantial. His attorney made 3 separate arguments for bail, all of which Harlan denied. The loan portfolio was placed in temporary receivership, pending transfer to the Territory Bank on the terms Evelyn had already discussed: same amounts, same schedules, no penalties, no acceleration. When it was over, when the room had emptied out to the cold November street, and the sound of voices talking about it carried from every direction, Evelyn stood outside the courthouse with Thomas and Cole and Harlan, and the judge shook her hand and said, "That was exceptional work, Mrs. Walker." "It was necessary work," she said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," he said. Cole said, "I owe you an apology for how long it took me to move." "I told you that already," she said. "Once is enough." He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." James Miller was waiting at the edge of the boardwalk with Ed Pruitt and Frank Dawes and the others, and when Evelyn and Thomas walked toward them, Miller stepped forward with his hat in his hand and said, "Mrs. Walker," and then stopped, because there wasn't a thing he could say that covered it. She said, "Get your family home, James. It's cold." He laughed, the right kind of laugh this time, and put his hat back on, and they all dispersed into the cold, and the afternoon light was going, and the smoke from the town's chimneys rose straight up in the still air, and Willow Creek was the same town it had been that morning, and was also in some permanent and unreversible way different. Thomas brought the wagon around, and Evelyn climbed up onto the seat, and he climbed up beside her, and they sat for a moment before he clicked to the horses. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes." "When we get home," he said, "I want to talk about the shed, the new one, what you want it to look like." She turned and looked at him. The light was going gold the way it does in November in Montana, long and low, and it was on his face and on the road ahead. And she felt something that had been clenched since the morning she stepped off the stagecoach. Not the fear, not the uncertainty, but something older than both of those, the specific bracing of a person who has learned not to expect solid ground. She felt it release. "Bigger than the last one," she said. "Proper foundation, south-facing windows for the light." "South-facing," he said. "And I want to put my father's name on it," she said. "Henry Carter, above the door." Thomas nodded once, started the horses moving. "Henry Carter," he said like he was committing it to memory. "I'll have the sign made." She faced forward. The road home was the same road it had always been, and she knew every turn of it now. And in the place where the shed would be rebuilt, there was only cleared ground and the faint marks of fire in the earth, which was not nothing, which was in fact exactly the right place to begin. The sign went up on a Tuesday morning in March of 1885. Thomas had it made by a woodworker in Billings, not Willow Creek, because he'd wanted it done right with proper lettering and good timber that would hold against the weather, and it had arrived on the stage 3 days ago and been sitting in the front room wrapped in canvas while the last of the new workshop's framing went up. He had not told Evelyn it had arrived. He had waited the way he'd learned to wait for the right moment, the way you wait for iron to reach the correct temperature before you commit to the strike. She was at the new foundation, checking the anchor bolts, when he brought it out. She didn't hear him until he was beside her, and when she looked up and saw what he was carrying, she went very still. It was bigger than she'd imagined. Good oak, dark-stained, with the letters cut clean and deep so they'd hold their edges through Montana winters. Henry Carter Workshop. She looked at it for a long moment. Thomas didn't say anything. He'd learned that too, when to talk, and when to simply stand there and let a moment be what it was. "It's right," she said finally. "Yes," he said. She reached out and put her hand flat against the wood against the H of her father's name, and stood like that for a moment, with the March wind moving around them both, and then she nodded once and stepped back. "Put it up," she said. "I want to watch." Billy and two of the ranch hands had the ladders ready, and Thomas had already measured the placement the day before, and the sign went up in 20 minutes, while Evelyn stood in the yard with her arms folded and watched every nail driven. When the last one was in, and the men stepped back, she looked at it for a long time from every angle, adjusting her position, checking the level, the way she checked all work, not just to approve it, but to understand it completely. Then she went back inside and picked up her hammer and got to work on the remaining wall brackets, and she didn't say anything else about it, and she didn't need to because the sign was up and her father's name was on it, and that was the thing said. The Henry Carter Workshop opened officially on the 1st of April, 1885. It was not a grand opening. Evelyn had not advertised. It had not posted notices, had not told anyone a specific date. What she had done was spend the preceding 3 weeks making sure everything was in its place. The forge rebuilt and run in for 2 weeks before she'd touched a single piece of customer work, the tools laid out on the new workbench in the same order her father had kept them, the south-facing windows throwing the morning light across the floor exactly as she'd wanted. On the morning of April 1st, she lit the forge at 5:30 and went to work. James Miller arrived at 7 with a broken axle fitting and a jar of honey from Sarah. He set the honey on the windowsill without comment and handed over the fitting and said, "I told Sarah not to bring the honey. She said I could keep that opinion to myself." Evelyn took the fitting and turned it in her hands. "Tell her thank you. She also wants you to come to dinner Sunday." "We'll come Sunday." He nodded, settled himself on the stool she'd positioned near the door, the same placement as the old shed, because some things shouldn't change, and watched her work the way he'd watched from the beginning, with that quality of attention that was the most honest compliment he knew how to pay. By noon, 4 other men had come. By the end of the first week, she had a full work order list for the first time in her life. Not favors, not exchanges, but paid work at fair prices, licensed through the county, with her name on the paperwork and her father's name above the door. Richard Coleman came on the 5th day. He came in the morning, and he looked around the workshop with the expression of a man taking inventory, and then he said, "I want to talk to you about something." "Sit down," she said. He sat. He turned his hat in his hands for a moment, which she recognized as Coleman's version of gathering himself. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said, back in October, about why the farmers were coming to you instead of me. I remember what I said. You said I'd been the only option long enough to forget that wasn't the same as being the best." He looked at her. "You were right." "Yes," she said. "I was." He almost smiled. "You don't soften things." "I used to," she said. "I stopped." She set down her file and looked at him properly. "What did you want to talk about, Coleman?" "I have more work than I can handle," he said. "Always have. The town's growing. But I'm one man, and there's only so many hours." He paused. "I'm not proposing a partnership. I know that's not. I just think if we had some kind of understanding about what each shop takes on, we wouldn't be tripping over each other. You take the fine work, the repair work, the detail jobs. I take the volume work, the structural stuff, the railroad contracts. He put his hat on his knee. We'd both do more business. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. You came here to propose a professional arrangement, she said. I came here to suggest it, yes ma'am. After spending October telling the town I was stealing your customers. He met her eyes. Yes. And trying to take Harrington's side before you thought better of it. Yes, he said, and there was no qualification in it, which was she had come to understand Coleman's version of an apology. She picked up her file again. Come back Thursday, she said. Bring your current work list, and I'll bring mine. We can talk about what makes sense. He stood. Put his hat on. Thursday, he said. After he left, Billy, who had been sweeping in the corner and pretending not to listen, said, You're going to work with him. I'm going to talk with him, she said. That's different. Billy thought about it. He didn't exactly treat you right when you first got here. No, she said. He didn't. She ran the file along the fitting she was working on, checking the edge. But he signed his name when it mattered, and he didn't sign the name Harrington wanted him to sign. That means something. Billy was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Walker, can I ask you something? You can ask. How do you decide who to trust? Like, how do you know? She thought about it. Really thought about it, because Billy was 19, and the question deserved a real answer. You watch what they do when it costs them something, she said. Not when it's easy. When it's hard. Coleman could have made his life simpler by doing what Harrington asked. He didn't. She set the fitting down. That's not the same as being a good man from the start. But it's not nothing. Billy nodded slowly. Reckon that's true, he said, and went back to sweeping. The territorial court concluded its proceedings against Victor Harrington in May. The charges were substantial fraud conspiracy to defraud suborning perjury in connection with Coleman's statement and 2 counts of arson. Arthur Renfield's investigation had uncovered the full scope of the land acquisition scheme, including 8 properties in 3 counties, that Harrington had obtained through manufactured foreclosure and resold to a holding company that existed as far as anyone could trace only on paper. Evelyn did not attend the sentencing hearing. She sent her written testimony she had already given her formal account during the inquiry proceedings, and she spent that day in the workshop because there was work to do, and she had learned a long time ago that justice being done did not require you to watch it happen. Thomas went. He came home in the evening and sat at the kitchen table, and she brought him coffee and sat across from him, and he said, 20 years, hard labor. She wrapped her hands around her cup. The land, she said. The 8 properties. 2 have already been returned to the original families. The others are in restitution proceedings. Renfield says it'll take most of a year to sort out. He looked at her. James Miller's farm is secure. His loan transferred to the Territory Bank at exactly the terms you negotiated. He's got 8 months of payments ahead of him, and the wheat is already in the ground. She nodded. Outside, the May evening was holding light long the way it did in Montana. Once winter finally gave way, the sky staying gold past 8 o'clock. Thomas, she said. Yes. I want to expand the workshop. Add a second forge in the fall. If the work volume holds through summer, which I think it will, we'll need the capacity. He looked at her over his coffee. That's a significant investment. I know. I've run the numbers. She pushed a paper across the table toward him. She'd been working on it for 2 weeks. The projections, the costs, the projected return over 18 months. He picked it up and read it with the attention he brought to the ranch accounts now, which was to say, with complete seriousness, because he had learned in the past 9 months that Evelyn Carter Walker's numbers were always right. He read through it twice, set it down. Fall, he said. September at the latest. I want it running before the winter work rush. He picked up his coffee. I'll talk to the lumber supplier this week. She folded the paper and set it aside, and felt not for the first time, but with a new kind of steadiness, the particular satisfaction of a life built to specification, not someone else's specification, but her own. It was in June that Sarah Miller's sister arrived in Willow Creek. Her name was Louise, 24 years old, newly widowed, coming to stay with the Millers while she sorted out what came next. She arrived on the stage from Denver with a trunk and 2 children under the age of 5, and the specific hollow-eyed exhaustion of a woman who has been holding herself together for so long that she no longer entirely remembers what it felt like not to. Sarah brought her to Evelyn's workshop on the 3rd day. Louise stood in the doorway and looked around at the forge and the tools and the sign above the door and said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "Mrs. Miller said you might be able to help me find some kind of work." Evelyn was at the workbench. She set down the piece she was working on and looked at Louise properly, not assessing her the way people had assessed Evelyn getting off the stage, measuring desperation, calculating worth. Looking at her, the way her father had looked at apprentices, for what was there, not what was missing. "What do you know how to do?" Evelyn asked. Louise looked surprised by the question. People usually told her what she could do, not asked. I can keep accounts. I was keeping the books for my husband's business before. She stopped. "I'm good with numbers." Evelyn thought about the growing stack of work orders on her desk. She thought about the Coleman arrangement, which had been formalized in May, and which had doubled both their work volumes. She thought about the second forge she was planning, and the expanded operation, and the fact that she had been keeping her own accounts since day one. But that time spent on accounts was time not spent on iron. "Can you start Monday?" Evelyn said. Louise blinked. "I just like that. You need work. I need someone good with numbers. That's not complicated." Evelyn picked up her piece again. "I pay fair wages. You'll work mornings Tuesday through Saturday. Monday, I'll show you the current books, and you can tell me what you think." Louise stood in the doorway for another moment, and something in her face was doing the ice-cracking thing, the same thing Evelyn's own face had done on her first morning in the shed, when she'd gotten the forge lit, for the first time, the giving way of something that had been held too rigid for too long. "Thank you, Mrs. Walker," she said. "Call me Evelyn," she said, "and bring your children Monday. Billy will watch them in the yard." Sarah Miller, standing behind her sister, caught Evelyn's eye. Evelyn looked back at her work. Summer came to Willow Creek the way summer comes to Montana late. And then all at once, the cold releasing overnight, and the days going long and warm, and the ranch filling up with the particular aliveness of a working season fully engaged. The cattle Thomas had brought in the spring were moving well. The hired men were efficient, and in the workshop behind the house with its south-facing windows and its 2 workbenches and the sign that said Henry Carter Workshop. Above the door, Evelyn worked every day from 5:30 until the light went, and Louise sat at the corner desk with the account books and a pen and the focused expression of a woman rediscovering what she was good at, and the sound of it all. The hammer, the file, the scratch of the pen, the voices of 2 small children in the yard under Billy's reluctant supervision was the sound of a thing working the way it was supposed to work. Martha Greaves came in July. She came on a Wednesday morning, which was not her usual shopping day, which meant it was deliberate, and she came alone, which meant she hadn't told anyone she was coming. She stood in the doorway of the workshop the same way Coleman had stood in the doorway of the old shed taking inventory recalibrating. Evelyn was at the forge. She didn't stop working. "Mrs. Walker," Martha said. "Martha," Evelyn said. A pause. "I have a gate hinge that's broken. Both my boys are useless with metalwork, and my husband's been in bed with his back for 2 weeks." "Bring it in," Evelyn said. Martha came in. She set the hinge on the workbench with the careful placement of a woman setting down something she's been carrying for longer than the walk from town. She watched Evelyn look it over. "It's not complicated," Evelyn said. "The pin sheared, 20 minutes. "I appreciate it," Martha said, and she stood there for a moment in which the air between them held the weight of everything that had been said on the boardwalk in July and September and October. And then Martha Greaves, who had been the moral compass of Willow Creek for 15 years and was currently renegotiating what that meant, said, "You've done something here." Evelyn looked up. "This town," Martha said carefully. "It's not the same as it was in July, when you arrived." She was choosing her words the way a woman chooses words when she means more than she's willing to say directly, and knows that the person she's talking to can hear what's underneath. "The Miller farm is still standing. The Pruitt farm is still standing. Frank Dawes's family came through winter without losing anything. And Harrington?" She stopped. 12 years he was here, and nobody moved on him. And you'd been here 4 months. "I had a document," Evelyn said. "You built a document," Martha said. "There's a difference." She folded her hands in front of her. "I said things when you arrived. I've said this already, and I know once is enough, but I want to be plain about it. I was wrong about what kind of woman you were." "You were wrong about what kind of woman this situation needed," Evelyn said. "Turns out, it needed one who knew how to read a contract." Martha looked at her for a moment with an expression that was on the near side of a smile. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it did." The hinge was done in 18 minutes. Martha paid without discussion and left without lingering, and Evelyn watched her go and thought about the particular courage it takes to change your mind about a person you've publicly underestimated, which is a different kind of courage than the kind that gets celebrated in newspapers but is not, in Evelyn's estimation, any less real. The second forge went in September exactly on schedule. Thomas and Billy and 2 other men spent a week on the foundation expansion, and the equipment came on 2 separate freight wagons from Billings, and Evelyn spent 4 days installing it herself, refusing help with the technical work because she needed to know every bolt and joint of it, the way she knew the original forge from the inside out by hand. The night it was done, she lit it for the first time. Thomas came out to watch. He brought 2 cups of coffee and handed her one and stood beside her in the new space, which was twice the size of the original shed, and smelled of new timber and hot iron, and the particular quality of a thing that has been made well. "How does it feel?" he said. She looked at the 2 forges burning side by side, at the doubled capacity, at the tools laid out on both benches, at her father's name on the sign, visible through the window in the fading September light. "Like it's supposed to be here," she said. Thomas looked at her. "You've been saying that about a lot of things lately." She glanced at him. "Have I?" He sipped his coffee. "The workshop, the work arrangement with Coleman, Louise, Sunday dinners at Miller's." He paused. "Me." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that a complaint?" she asked. "That is the opposite of a complaint," he said. She looked back at the forge, felt the heat of both of them against her face, felt the weight of the hammer in her hand, which she'd picked up out of habit, the way you pick up the thing that belongs in your hand. Felt the particular steadiness of a life that had been built piece by piece from cleared ground with full knowledge of the fire it had passed through to get here. "Thomas," she said. "Yes. I want to tell you something." He waited. He was very good at waiting now. It was one of the things she had come to depend on, the quality of his waiting, which was not passive, but active. The way a man waits when he genuinely wants to hear what comes next. "When I answered that advertisement," she said, "I told myself I was being practical, that it was a calculated decision, that I needed room, and this was the available option." She turned the hammer in her hand. "I wasn't lying. That was all true." She looked at him. "But I've been thinking about it lately, and I think what I was actually doing was hoping. I just didn't let myself call it that because I'd been disappointed enough times that hope felt like something I couldn't afford," Thomas said. And now I can afford it," she said. "That's what I wanted to tell you." He stood with that for a moment. Then he reached over and took the coffee cup from her free hand gently, the way you take something from a person's hand when you want them to have both hands free. And he kissed her there in the new workshop with the 2 forges burning and the September dark coming in and her father's name above the door. It was the first time. It had taken 9 months to get there. 9 months of coffee cups and kitchen tables and documents and hands on shoulders and the slow, patient building of something that neither of them had known how to name while they were building it. But it arrived the way things that are built, right, always arrive, not with a sudden declaration, but with the accumulated weight of everything that had come before it, making the moment feel above all else like it was supposed to be here. She was still holding the hammer. He pulled back and looked at it and said, "Do you take that everywhere?" "Most places," she said. He laughed. She had not heard him laugh like that before. Unguarded, unmanaged, the laugh of a man who is not performing happiness, but simply having it. It suited him, she thought. She intended to hear it more. The harvest dinner that fall was at the Walker Ranch. It had not been planned as a harvest dinner. It had started as Sunday dinner at the Millers, which had been moved to the Walker Ranch because Evelyn's kitchen was larger, and then Ed Pruitt had asked if he and his wife could come, and Thomas had said, of course, and then Frank Dawes, and then Coleman, and then Louise and her children. And then, somewhat to everyone's surprise, including her own Martha Greaves, had appeared at the door with a pie and the expression of a woman who has decided to change her habits and is seeing it through. By 6 o'clock, there were 22 people in and around the Walker kitchen, and Thomas had moved the table outside, and Billy had built a fire in the yard because the October air had a bite to it, and James Miller's oldest boy was chasing Louise's children around the yard, while Billy pretended not to be charmed by it. Evelyn stood at the edge of all of it and let herself look. She thought about July, about the stagecoach, about the women on the boardwalk saying "poor creature" and meaning it, or thinking they did, thinking they were describing the situation accurately, measuring the desperation of a woman traveling 2,000 miles to marry a stranger. They had not been entirely wrong about the distance traveled. They had been entirely wrong about what moved her. Frank Dawes came to stand beside her. He was a man of few words by nature. Frank Dawes, which was part of why his testimony at the hearing had been so effective, and he stood next to her for a moment, looking at the yard full of people before he said, "You know what I keep thinking about." "Tell me," she said, "that document you put on Cole's desk, all those pages." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been farming this county for 16 years. I've watched Harrington operate for 10 of them. And I always thought, well, he's the bank money. That's just how it is. There's nothing to be done." He shook his head. "Turns out there was something to be done. Turns out it was always there to be done. I just didn't know how to do it." "Now you do," Evelyn said. "I read my new loan contract," he said. "The Territory Bank one. Read every word. Took me 2 hours." He glanced at her. "Found one clause I wanted to understand better. Brought it to Louise." Evelyn raised her eyebrows slightly. "Louise read it. Louise read it, told me what it meant, and drafted a letter asking the bank to clarify the language in writing." He paused. "She said you taught her to do that." Evelyn thought about Louise at the corner desk, working through the account books, and then working through her own documents with the same focused precision, and she thought about her father teaching her to read everything he signed, and she thought about what it meant to pass something on. "I didn't teach her," she said. "I just showed her it was possible." Dawes nodded slowly. "Reckon that's the whole thing, isn't it?" he said. "Showing people it's possible." He went back inside to get more coffee, and Evelyn stayed where she was for another moment, watching the fire in the yard and the people around it. And she thought about the original shed, the broken roof, the collapsed wall, the rusted chimney pipe leaning at a wrong angle, the door with the arc worn in the dirt. She thought about the way Thomas had said, "I keep meaning to tear it down," and she had said, "Don't." She had known, she thought now. Not in a way she could have explained that morning in July, not with words, not with logic. But somewhere beneath the practical calculation, beneath the assessment of the structure, beneath the metalworker's eye for what could be repaired, she had known. That a broken thing was not nothing. That a broken thing in the hands of someone who understood what it had been was something entirely different. That the right person at the right moment with the right tools and the willingness to use them could take what everyone else had given up on and make it into the thing it had always been trying to be. Thomas came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He put his arm around her, and they stood together at the edge of the firelight and watched the yard full of people who were there, because of a chain of decisions that had started with a woman who chose a broken shed over a mansion. Not because she was foolish, and not because she was desperate, and not because she had nothing better to choose. Because she saw what it could become. Because she was the person who could make it become that. Because sometimes the most radical act available to you is to look at what everyone else has written off and say not yet. Not while I still have my hands and my father's hammer and a forge I can light in the dark. Coleman appeared at her other side. Somewhat to her surprise, he was not by nature a man who sought out conversation at gatherings, and he stood there for a moment and said, "That second forge, you running it tomorrow?" 5:30, she said. "I've got a commission I could use help on. Structural brackets, 12 of them, big order, more than I can turn around by myself in the timeline." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has been stubborn his whole life and has recently been given cause to question the return on that investment. "My place or yours?" she said. He thought about it. "Yours has the better equipment now." 5:30 then, she said. "Don't be late." He nodded once, the nod of a man sealing an agreement, and moved away toward the food, and Thomas, who had heard all of it, said quietly, "Coleman in your workshop at 5:30 in the morning." "He does good work when he applies himself," she said. "You apply everyone around you," he said. "Have you noticed that?" "I've noticed," she said. "Is that something you learned, or something you are?" She thought about it honestly. Thought about her father, about the way he'd moved through his shop, not commanding, not directing, but creating the conditions in which the people around him rose to the level of the work because the work demanded it, and he'd made them believe they could meet the demand. "Both, I think," she said. Thomas tightened his arm around her shoulders briefly, the specific pressure of a man communicating something he doesn't need to say out loud, and then Ed Pruitt called from the fire, and they went over. The evening lasted until past 9, which was late for working people in Montana in October, and when the last wagon had rattled down the road, and Billy had banked the yard fire, and Louise's children had been wrapped in blankets and loaded into the miller's wagon half asleep, and when the kitchen had been straightened and the lamps turned down to the ones they kept burning through the night, Thomas and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table one final time with the last of the coffee and the quiet of the house settling around them. The account books were in their place. The document, Evelyn's original document, all its pages, was in the file she'd built for it in the corner shelf alongside Renfield's materials, and the letters from the Territory Bank, and the formal record of the inquiry proceedings. Everything organized the way her father had organized the shop records by date and subject, so that whatever you needed, you could find without looking. On the table between them was the hammer. She'd brought it in at the end of the evening without thinking, and it was sitting there, the way it always sat, when she wasn't holding it, waiting patient. The cracked hickory handle worn to the exact shape of the hand that had held it for 30 years before hers. Thomas looked at it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "If the letter had been different, if I'd advertised differently, if I'd—" He paused, choosing the words. "If the circumstances had been different, and you'd had other options, other places to go, would you still have ended up here?" She looked at the hammer. Looked at the window, at the dark outside it, at the place where the workshop was with its south-facing windows, and its 2 forges, and her father's name above the door. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think I needed somewhere that had room for what I was, and I didn't know where that was." She looked at him. "I know now." He nodded slowly. "I think you would have found it," he said. "Whatever it took. I think you would have found the place eventually." "Maybe," she said. "But I found this one." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, over the hand that was resting beside the hammer, the hand that had built 2 workshops and read 11 contracts and changed the course of 12 families, and written the document that brought down a man who'd thought himself untouchable. "You found this one," he said. Outside, the Montana night was clear and cold and enormous, the way only a Montana sky in October can be, and the workshop stood with its new timber and its good foundation, and the sign above the door that said what it said, and the forge was cold now, but would not be cold long because it would be lit again at 5:30 in the morning, the way it was lit every morning, the way it had been lit from the first day, She brought it back to life, because the fire was the beginning of the work, and the work was the thing that mattered, and the work was never finished, it only transformed. That was what Evelyn Carter Walker knew in her bones, and in her hands, the way you know the things that have been true about you since before you had words for them. Iron does not become what it is meant to be lying cold in the dark. It becomes what it is meant to be in the fire, under the hammer, in the hands of someone who knows what it can hold. She had always known what she could hold. She had come 2,000 miles to finally have room to prove it. And she had.